So when the world, had privatized banks, you had wealth by families. When you can look back at the history, you had, these very wealthy. So if you look back, and this is where like kind of some of the conspiracy theories come from. So obviously, the Rothschild family, they had banks. They levered their interests in order to control governments and create privatized banks. And then they pushed out the central banking model. Like that was one era. But what I've seen is that people get stuck in an old paradigm without the fluidity of how the world actually changes. So power dynamics change. For example, it used to be ground, it used to be physical land. But now you can have a country that doesn't have that much land, but access to, like Singapore, for example, incredibly powerful because it has access to, these financial products and various other, influence in these choke points. And so you can have you can have strength in something and be very important to the network. But then as technology changes and as financialization changes, power can change significantly. So if you look at the old, banking dynasty families, you had the Warburg family, for example. The Warburg family was a governor in the Reichsbank, which is the bank that funded Nazi Germany and fascism. But also his brother was on the governor on the Federal Reserve. And so you had, Wall Street funded the Bolshevik Revolution during World War One, which took the Communist Manifesto, overthrew the Russian Tsar, and installed the Soviet Union. So similar families installed a central bank in America, were funded Nazi Germany, and were also funding communism.
Wow.
And so these families would hedge and profit from every side of a war. So after World War II, we immediately entered into a Cold War.
Crazy.
And that was the Soviet Union, communism, and fake capitalism, which is a Federal Reserve that creates a debt-based Ponzi scheme in order to consolidate power over to the banks and where we are today. And so you can go down these conspiratorial routes, but what you end up in when you follow the dynamic of how it works today is many of these families structured their wealth into trust companies, offshore trust companies, and those offshore trust companies became exited and became shareholders and would hedge some of their wealth with gold and various other things, neutral assets. But they ended up public companies because going public is the exit strategy.
Right.
And so then once you've got all these banks that are going public, you then had the invention of engineered things like the global financial crisis. When you look at what happened during the global financial crisis, well, the Federal Reserve needed access to data and technology in order to decide which banks to go bust and which ones to bail out. Who was providing that technology? Well, it was BlackRock. And what did BlackRock determine they should do? Well, they should let these banks go bust. They should issue loans to these banks. These ones are the shareholders in the Fed as well, just so happens. And then we should divest Barclays iShares, which is the ETF department that BlackRock controls today. And so by having these ETFs, you essentially got everyone's pension, everyone's endowment money through colleges and universities, everyone's auto loans, everyone's mortgages, everyone's insurance premiums to passively invest and hand over their voting to BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. And then they became shareholders in each other. And so BlackRock bought shares in Vanguard, Vanguard bought shares in State Street, Vanguard's still a private company. Yeah. And so you end up with this massive web of, in the end, what I would call a decentralized but unaccountable power structure, which actually does rule the world. But you can make mistakes. It's like nodes, right? Like Bitcoin. You could be running a node for this network, but this network, it doesn't have, it's not governed by maths and code, an algorithm. It's governed by a ruthless game. where people can throw each other off the network all the time, and power dynamics shift in this network. And so, if you look at BlackRock, they own board seats and shares in over 20,000 companies. And they passively get 12.5 trillion of assets to manage. Across State Street, Vanguard, BlackRock, and others, there's about 25 to $30 trillion of assets. Mm-hmm. Whoever owns those shares rules the world. Now, who owns the vast majority and the voting shares? Well, then you've got a power dynamic that changes.